Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to handle the first few slides and then turn it over to my dad to talk about his experience. This program has a bit of a backstory. Those of you who are members of the club may remember 3 years ago we had our potluck dinner, and our after-dinner activity was describe your favorite place. And I decided to pick a rather far-out place. This is what's described, and I basically read this Wikipedia page that describes Barnes Peak, which is a peak in Antarctica, 11,000 feet high, named after my dad, who was a cosmic ray scientist at Hallett Station in 1963, and you'll hear that whole story tonight. So that's what led to this program. So a few brief words of introduction about Antarctica. I think some of the statistics just kind of boggle the mind. 5.5 million square miles. To give you a comparison, the U.S. is only 3.8 million square miles. So, or you could fit, I think, 2 Australias inside the landmass of Antarctica. So it's an enormous place. The other thing I want to point out on this map here that's an interesting feature is the Antarctic Circle. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Arctic Circle, but it actually has a definition. And what it is, in the case of the Antarctic Circle, it's the northernmost point where the sun is above the horizon for 24 continuous hours at least once a year. So that's about 66 degrees southern latitude. So one other feature I wanted to point out here, you may have heard of people or know people who have gone to the Antarctic on a tourist expedition. Typically they go to this place up here known as the Antarctic Peninsula, and that's relatively easily accessed from the southernmost point in Argentina. The city's called Ushuaia. The place we're going to be talking about tonight, though, is actually nearer to New Zealand. And I'll have a more detailed map here in a second, but just know that it's nearer to New Zealand than it is to South America. The other thing you need to know as a way of introduction as to why my dad was in Antarctica is this thing called the International Geophysical Year, which was 1957 to the end of 1958. And what this was an 18-month international project intended to advance Earth science. And it was timed to coincide with when the solar activity was at its highest. And so you could do things like study cosmic rays, like my dad did. There was a special focus, though, on Antarctica, and 12 nations established research stations there. And I just love some of these stamps. I especially love in this Japanese stamp, this emperor penguin looking up at the, kind of looking up in wonder at the Earth. There's a U.S. stamp. There's also an Ecuadorian stamp. 2 things you can see on that. There's a rocket circling the Earth and also a satellite. Because you have to put your minds back in that time. Satellites were brand new. And actually during that 18-month period, that was when Sputnik launched. So that's the sort of time frame we're talking about. And the satellite was also believed to be a technology you could use to study the Earth. So in 1959, despite the Cold War and despite all the space race and things like that, a really amazing thing happened. 12 nations, including the U.S. and the Soviet Union, came together to negotiate a treaty about the Antarctic. Those of you who read the program description read some of the basics. Its major provisions were it suspended all territorial claims, it permitted only peaceful activities, and it required the free exchange of scientific data. You could have no nuclear testing and no nuclear waste disposal, and all facilities would be open to inspection by other nations. Also in that same year, in 1959, the U.S. Antarctic Research Program was established under the National Science Foundation. So that was sort of how the U.S. focused its efforts on Antarctica. And then just one more map here. This is a zoom in of our map that we saw earlier. McMurdo Station that you see down here is and was the primary logistics base for the U.S. in Antarctica. That was established for this geophysical year in February 1956. But the place we're going to be talking most about tonight right here is Hallett Station. That's where my father was stationed. That was also built for this geophysical year in December 1956. And it was the first international base in Antarctica shared by the U.S. and New Zealand. This is just a more detailed map of Hallett Station area. The station itself was on this sort of northwest area of this peninsula of land jutting out into the Ross Sea. It had two purposes. It was for geophysical research, but it was also to provide weather data for aircraft that were flying overhead down to McMurdo. And it was up on this peninsula because it could be accessed by ships during the summer when the ice broke up. And this was, you'll see this name here, CB Hook. And CB, for those of you who know something about the military, it's a U.S. Navy term. It stands for Construction Battalion. And you'll see their logo down here. That's a World War II era logo. The National Science Foundation certainly had the scientific firepower to do all their activities in South America, but they were scientists. They didn't know how to build stations, or they didn't have logistics or aircraft, but the U.S. Navy did. And so that's why they brought in the Seabees. They could get the McMurdo and the Hallett stations up and running very quickly. And the fact that there were some nesting Adelie penguins in the Hallett area, that was just a temporary little inconvenience. The records indicate that about 7,500 penguins had to be displaced to make even just this small station here. The station studied meteorology, geomagnetism, the auroras, the ionosphere, and also seismology, sort of earthquakes. So I think that's all I have to say. I'll turn it over to you to talk about. This is your leaving for your trip down there. You can talk about how you got down there.
Well, incidentally, I need to get one of my fact sheets so I can remember what I want to say. Okay, thank you. And really, it happened this way. It was in spring. I was at the University of Maryland studying for a degree in physics. It was the end of my junior year, and I needed to borrow a book. So I went into the lab where I was working as an hourly, and when I opened the door, one of the managers jumped up and said, "How would you like to go to the Antarctic for a year?" And I thought about it, I'd never been there. So I said, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "Rebuild 2 experiments and babysit them." And when? He said, "In the fall." This was in the spring. And I said, "What's the pay?" And he said, $5K, but all your expenses will be covered. Well, it seemed like a pretty interesting idea. I had never been there. So in the fall, that summer, I worked in the lab with him. And I caught a plane in the fall through I can do the various steps, but that will bore you needlessly. You have to remember, this is back 60 years. This is before the internet, before satellites. We had no landline. And it was an interesting place, and frankly, we're chauvinists. We're Northern Hemisphere chauvinists, because very seldom do we look at anything below the equator. And the closest landmass happens to be Australia, New Zealand, and South America. My military service was behind me at this point, and I had a chance to travel some. But it's difficult to remember back 60 years what it was like not to have the internet, not to have a telephone. And all of these things we gave up. The ice, which was right here, the ice at Hallett, CB Hook, was up to 80 to 100 feet thick. So really, we were truly isolated for the winter. There were 18 people who wintered over. And frankly, all of our needs were met by the military. Communication, food, water, power, what have you. However, there was no telephone contact. The only contact we had was with hams who were able to establish a line.
Amateur radio.
The military, and I'm not complaining because they provided us food, they provided us, they took care of us. But it was different. I think I spoke with my wife-to-be then twice, maybe 3 times during my year. Nothing came out or went in the wintertime. The ice extended out, I did a calculation this morning, as much as many hundreds of miles into the ocean were froze solid. And the penguins, which was one of the reasons for having CB hook, would proceed to move out to open water and live off of krill, which are little shrimp type of things. However, they had only one idiosyncrasy. They always returned to the place of their birth. Matter of fact, they had to build a corral, a 55-gallon oil drum, to keep the penguins out of the buildings, because a couple cases they would walk in with a pebble and drop it on the floor because that's where they were born. Now, the important thing to remember, there are no trees, there are no shrubs. The only ground vegetation was mosses and mosses. We had lichens, and so the penguins built their nests out of pebbles to get them out of the meltwater. In the summertime, everything melted. I'm a farm kid, and I'm not bothered by odors. But because when we went in, everything was frozen. But as the year progressed, the smell started. And summer people who came in had a difficult time adjusting to the smell. But imagine a barnyard had not been cleaned for a couple of millennia. But it did get the pebbles did get the nest out. And in the wintertime, the penguins proceeded to move out always on the open water so they could get food. There was 18 of us who spent the winter at Hallett. There were 9 civilians, 3 Kiwis. It was a joint U.S.-New Zealand station. And there were 6 scientists, 7 scientists, 6 scientists. We were studying various things. You asked, why were you there to rebuild these instruments? And the reason was cosmic rays now, we believe, have a great effect upon the weather. And they are energetic particles that come from many stars, even our sun. And they cause a change in the weather. So I spent my year in a hut. Scott, do we have pictures of this? Or is
well, we do. Let me flip through a few. This is just a view of the peninsula. This is a view of CB Hook. This is not you know, down.
Oh, sorry. This was a summer person who came in. He's studying mosses, I think, from Ohio State. Here's what the station looked like. My hut was right there.
And we'll have a picture of that coming up.
Oh, okay. It was a plywood building, and
it's another view of the station, I think. And shows some of the icebergs.
It's Jeffrey Markham, not Jeffrey Markham. And this is wintertime, and there are no penguins. They've already followed the sea to the north where they can get food.
And then we'll show here the penguins have arrived.
And these are standing around waiting for it to get warmer.
And here you'll see some of their habits. You know, that this was where their nest was. And okay, so there was an oil drum there. They'll just make their nest on top of the oil drum. So, and then finally, there's
my shack. I had 2 experiments, which I'll show you that. And I basically spent all my time there, except for meals. I'd go into the base. The base was 5 minutes away, I could walk. But this was, to me, a very happy time. I had no reports, no phone ringing, and I got 3 square or 4 square meals, as the case may be, a day. To me, it was heaven. And I was starting to become my senior year in physics, but I had no teacher, so I had to teach myself.
It's your experiments, I think.
There's one of the experiments. The question, why have an experiment here? Well, cosmic rays are either neutral or charged particles. They come from further into the center of the galaxy, or even some from our own sun. And what happens, because of the charged particles, we are saved and protected by them because of the Earth's geomagnetic field. So the whole purpose of locating the station here, as well as, which is only a couple hundred miles from the southern geometric pole, there's another one in Canada, which I went up for another experiment. And these are windows that allow us to be able to look at the cosmic rays before they are distorted by the Earth's magnetic field and the Earth's atmosphere. This is a neutron detector. It's got a whole bunch of lead bricks and wax, and that's one of the instruments that I rebuilt. And I spent the year, here's a scintillation counter used to detect charged particles. There's a photomultiplier in here. And down here is a big crystal that when a charged particle strikes it, it gives off a flash of light. There's a photomultiplier up here that proceeds to look at that flash of light and count it. And so these 2 instruments allow us to be able to get an idea of the cosmic ray showers.
It's just a different view of the same thing, right?
Yeah. To me, this was wonderful. After I rebuilt both of these, this one was before it was rebuilt, a prior picture, they required no attention at all. I just had to record data once a day, and that took less than 10 minutes. It was heaven. I could read as much as I wanted. There were no complaints, and where I slept, the Sea Beach built me a workbench of 3/4 inch plywood, and I put a sleeping bag on that at night because in the village or in the base, the sleeping hut was too hot for me. I was close to the ceiling. So I slept in a sleeping bag on the workbench, and I went into the base for my meals. It was wonderful.
I think we have a picture of some of your colleagues here. So.
Yes. Here are some of the summer people.
And I think this is you, right?
Yep, that was me.
So, and then...
Oh. They drank it all. They really did. There was great discussion, and they'd be able to get through it. They surprised themselves.
And then this had to come in by ship, right?
Yes, it was coming in. It had to wait. Early on, the rhythm was, early on, we were able to get mail in by going out on the sea ice and building runways, which was strong enough to hold up the plane. We got mail in. But the bulk goods, like the beer and other crucial items, came in by ship with an icebreaker that broke its way through the ice.
And I think we have some of your...
Here are some of my colleagues. There was a great difference between the Kiwis and the Navy and 6 civilians. But by and large, we got along amazingly well, even though I suspect that some of the people were scared of darkness, which we had. The only, at midwinter, which is as dark as it got, everybody on the station came out and looked north, and we watched the sun come up, appear. 2 minutes later, it was blowing ice again. So that was midwinter.
There's your cook.
Our cook, that was one of the nice things about having the Navy. We had a really talented cook that provided all our meals. This hero picture here was taken a little further north at Cape Adair, which is right now the only place you can get into the Antarctic that has a great many of the features. These are juvenile Adelie penguins up here. I'm up about 1,000 feet on a cliff, on a climb, and you can see the icebergs out here. I'm wearing crampons, so I will not, on ice, I will not slip. But the interesting thing, the feather is for all your bird watchers. The skuas lay their eggs open on gravel. And when you approach the area they decided is their nest, what they will do to attract your attention, they come over and just tap the top of your head. The feather allows them to scare you off without damaging your head. And the reason for the knife, we wound up with some DKWs, which were used for island landings in the Pacific. And these were now, let's see, 44. These were 10 years old. And what happens, all the fittings in them had lost their ability to retain moisture. And we've had, early on, we had vessels that broke through the ice and immediately sank. And the problem was the doors, as you cannot open the doors. So the purpose of the knife to allow us to cut our way out. Fortunately, when I was there, we did not have to use that. Here is on the sea ice. The ice froze, depending, certainly 6 or maybe 10 feet thick, depending upon the area, even though there was very salty.
I think we have a quick movie here. This is, I think, taken from a ship you were on, showing some icebergs.
These things were acres in size, to give you an idea of the scale.
And then this is a brief clip showing a helicopter coming in. Well, you'll see first 2 ships. There's the icebreaker, there's a cargo ship, I believe, and then a helicopter coming in to land at the base. So.
These are skua, incidentally, these birds that just came by are skua.
So this was how you got from the ship to the base, right?
Yeah.
And you'll notice in the Antarctic, a lot of the aircraft are painted orange, so they stand out from the snow.
Yes, that's great. Yeah, something can be done. You can be seen, and that's so important because there's much whiteness, I'll put it like this, in the Antarctic.
Yeah, we'll see some of that right here, actually.
Yeah, here's a couple of icebergs that have run aground in the shallows by CB hook.
And then,
Barney, how cold was it there? Like, it doesn't look like everybody is bundled up.
he's asking how cold
How
is it?
cold is it?
Well, it depends. If there's wind, it's very cold. But I've been out wearing not a whole lot more than I presently have on with a jacket, and working for hours at a time without any discomfort. Matter of fact, and because this is summer, getting sunburned was a real problem because you had light reflecting back from the ice.
And then this is, I guess, inside some of these run-agrounds, icebergs.
Yes.
So, let's see another.
And some of the blues, unfortunately, the film cannot capture. I think these are film. This is film that I developed. I had a kit to allow me to do Kodachrome while I was there.
Okay. And now we're going to get into some of the animals and bird life.
You know, elephant seal. And again, you can see the penguins, the Adelies. And these are Weddell seals. They're very gentle creatures. They're sunning themselves because that's how they get their vitamin B.
And then we have a quick film clip here of some a Weddell seal.
Incidentally, this is how mermaids, the legend of mermaids, notice the black flippers. The whalers, incidentally, this area of around Hallett was very rich in sea life. There's virtually no land animals. I think the biggest creature we had was some tiny insects that you probably needed a magnifier to be able to see them. But all of the life in the ocean is incredibly rich because it's something called the Antarctic convergence. Even though it's frozen, nutrients are brought up from down below and offered access to sea life. For example, that's a reason why the whalers went to the Antarctic to benefit from these wonderful creatures.
A couple more seals.
Now, this is a bad guy. This is a leopard seal. And his after the baby Weddell have been born here.
We'll give another view.
Yeah, matter of fact, notice here an orca apparently got a whack at this guy. That's what caused those scars.
Okay. Okay, and this next clip is about the skuas. So you'll see initially a baby skua and then an adult.
And you notice that's the nest. There's nothing there. And they, of course, prey on the baby
Baby
penguins.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, this is going to show you the Adelie rookery. We mentioned, there are a lot of Adelies here. This will give you a good sense of exactly how many there were.
And these are the babies. They're covered with fur as they mature, and they lose the fur. And there were like 100,000 here at Cape Adair, which was to the north about 100 miles. They had 300,000 Adelies.
There's the station in the background here.
You can see the station and the icebergs as well that are running around.
Okay, this is video going to show you an Adelie stealing a rock, and this is something I think what they often rob from their fellow Adelies.
And they did this all summer long, 24 hours a day.
So it's good for his nest, I guess. This is going to show a chick, an Adelie feeding a chick.
They fed, of course, by regurgitation. So.
Yeah, because the Adelie had to swim out, I guess, get the krill. The kid kept it in their crop, I think, and then they regurgitated so the baby could eat it.
And later in the year, when ice developed, sometimes there's quite a far trip out to get open water so they could get to krill. And normally they had 2 babies. Sometimes they only had 1.
Yeah. This is going to show Adelies porpoising, because this is going to, through 2 videos here that will show you how good they were as swimmers and how sort of ungainly they were and uncomfortable on land. It's such a contrast. So,
They flew in the water. They're eating, incidentally, when they're disappearing. They probably got a school of krill. They're trying to herd so they can get access to it.
And this is going to show them swimming and then sort of jumping out.
Yes, underwater. Notice the graceful.
Now, are these pictures that you took yourself?
I took those, yes. And they're kind of standing around waiting until someone falls off the ice into the water. So, very difficult when you're burning film. And
Eventually they decide to go back in the water, I guess.
they provided endless amusement.
Yeah, this is one of the more amusing ones you'll see.
My wife, after seeing these, she remembers Al Cap's schmooze, and that's what they resemble, to my mind. And sometimes 2 eggs hatch, then you have a big problem. And here are the other guys, emperors. Emperors were big, they were about this tall.
These are juveniles, I think you said, right? Or maybe
I can't
just-
tell until I see the upper half of the picture.
Okay.
I think these are because of the coloration. After I left in 1963, they found an emperor colony that no one knew about. About 6 miles from Hallett before. And I recommend all you bird lovers, if you've not seen this, March of Penguins. It was done by a group from the French station. And it's difficult to communicate how the weather influenced what we did. For example, they show a crew. There were 2 people who were doing a study, and they got caught in a blizzard, and they were less than a mile from the station. And they had trouble being rescued despite all of the resources that the French had. But it gives you an idea of how really different this weather happens to be in Antarctica. One of the things I mentioned, there are a number of mysteries, but a couple of that I experienced. The Norwegians have a term called sastrugi, and that is when you have sea ice and snow falls on it that's still fluid at that point, but it winds up getting blown into very small drifts, maybe this tall, and gets melted because of the sun. And this is almost a corduroy sort of thing. But the interesting thing in walking on it, when you break through the crust, it is very tiring. And after a while, I couldn't believe this when it happened to me. I could tell whether that would support my weight or that would support my weight. But I had no I couldn't consciously determine that. But my brain was tired of lifting my foot out of this frozen stuff. So that's one of the mysteries. The other thing, we have a term that we use called and here in North America, whiteout means something when you have a blowing snow. There is a second type of whiteout when we use theory. You have a lower layer of clouds, and you have light that diffused through it, bounced off the ice and back again, and they stole all of the visual references that you had. And I've been in one once, and you normally avoid those because they're quite dangerous. And I could not tell where the surface was, whether it was down an inch or 6 inches. Totally different. You never experience this in the north.
This just shows the contrast, I think, between the size of the Adelies and the size of the emperors. I think we have another similar one here.
Yes, we really confused them, humans did, because we stand up like emperors do, but we're not. And here is late in the year, and you see Jeffrey Markham in the background, which always look different depending upon the light.
And then I think we have some nesting.
Yeah, you could tell the bachelors because they wound up having these very tall layers of stones. They had not found a mate, or maybe the mate had gotten killed or damaged and did not return a divorce, an Antarctic divorce. And they continued collecting rocks. It was easy to find. And incidentally, the place I stayed, Hallett Station, was located in that portion of the Antarctic called the Banana Belt. And it was called the Banana Belt because it got above freezing in the summertime.
I want to talk about sort of what happened in the station.
Well,
other dangers.
I was going to get some of the dangers.
Yeah.
There are some dangers, obviously, in this environment. One of them happens to be crevasses. You have all the snow that falls near the South Pole, and as it compacts, it turns to ice, and then it flows like molasses towards the ocean. And it starts out as the South Pole at 10,000 feet, 2 miles. And it floats to the ocean, which is sea level. And obviously, it's got some adjustments to make, and so it cracks and fractures. And those fractures get covered by snow, and you cannot tell what's underneath. We have a Swiss friend who lost her father in a crevasse. And they could not recover the body until the iceberg, or until the flow of ice melted enough and his body appeared at the outline. But the real danger that we were made aware of happens to be fire. Because here you have water down there. It's below freezing, so you didn't have water. The Argentines lost an entire station. We only lost a small building initially. And so fire is a real danger. The Russians lost one guy. He got caught in a fire and had a door iced up and he could not escape. Later on, we had a big fire, which I'll talk about in a moment. Any questions so I don't bore you to death here needlessly? Beg pardon?
Great.
You're doing great.
All good.
All good. All good. Okay, another mystery that I found fascinating. Aurora Australis and Borealis. Aurora, which actually the Earth rotates in terms of a portion of the sun. And you get aurora, you have charged particles, some of which are very interesting. But auroras generate sound in the human mind. I mean, they're up 80 or 90 miles. And no one has ever explained how this happens.
Excuse me. Can the sound be recorded electronically? Can the sound be recorded, or is it just something that...
I have never tried. Obviously, I don't think they have been, at least not to my knowledge. But I've seen them mentioned. I happen across up on Hudson's Bay as well as in the Antarctic. So.
And I think your view of the stars was very good down there, right?
Yes, the air is so incredibly clear There's no suspension. And it's amazing how you were able to see so far at night without using a flashlight or any form of artificial illumination. Humidity was so low down there that became skin problems were a real problem. And normally we only took a shower every 10 days because otherwise our skins dry out and we had problems. Well, I mentioned about the fire. A friend had taken about 1,000 feet of film showing the entire life cycle of the penguin. And it was drying in the science building. And there was a fire that burned the science building to the ground, literally, about 3 weeks after I left. So my data was never reduced. Unfortunately, the fire burned, when it burned the science building, it burned down the only timekeeper that we had on the station. And so, very quickly, people decided there could be no more scientific programs. My replacement was sent back to New Zealand. I'd already been home now for 3 weeks. And so, eventually, the whole station was shut down, dismantled, and carried back to New Zealand.
We're going to show that here in a minute. Yeah.
Okay. And you'll see.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about it. The station did operate, I think, in the summer only until 1973. But it was mostly after that point left in place with the thought that it might be reopened someday. But I guess the U.S. and New Zealand authorities eventually decided they needed to clean this place up. So they started that cleanup process in 1984. Now the biggest challenges they had were to remove fuel tanks, like this very large one that you see in the background here.
The bladder.
Yeah. And they could only do this during the summer, the Antarctic summer, so it took them a number of years. I think the cleanup was not completed until 2010. But the Cape Hallett area is now a specially protected area under that Antarctic treaty. Besides the large Adelie colony, it has populations that we mentioned of mosses, lichens, mites, springtails, and nematodes. And the penguins, I mentioned some of the disruptions that occurred when the station was first built. Their numbers fluctuate, but they are slowly repopulating that area. They are slowly moving back into that area, that footprint where the station was located. Right now, South Korea has a temporary research camp at that location, but it only accommodates 12 people, and probably only during summertime. It's not a year-round facility. So, about 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, I did an internet search on Hallett Station, and I found some of the pictures you see here. I was aware Hallett Station had closed, but I did not know that parts of it had become a museum exhibit in Christchurch, New Zealand. In Christchurch, I don't think we specifically mentioned, but that was the jumping off place. That was where the U.S. Antarctic Research Program was located. So, when Dad took his flight, or when other folks took their flights to the U.S. stations, that's where they departed from. So a big part of the Canterbury Museum's mission is to document the history of human exploration of the Antarctic. And our family was sort of interested in going to New Zealand, so we got in contact with the museum, and that led to this. And this is my dad and my late mother. And in the center there is Roger Fife, who was, I think at the time, the curator of human history at the Canterbury Museum. So Dad had accumulated some clothing, from his time there, some other artifacts, and as a family we decided we didn't really want to keep them. And so we decided to donate them to the museum, and so that's what we're doing here. We're sort of have a duffel bag worth of some clothing. Is there anything you wanted to point out there about what we...
Well, what happened, I wore, when I was there, most times, I wore a Navy jacket. So all of my Antarctic stuff, made by the Arctic Institute of North America, was virtually brand new. And so rather than just taking it home and putting it in the closet so Scott could fumble over it, I decided it would be a good idea to be able to preserve this for other folks. So all of the stuff was donated to the university there, which I think is important because we spent a lot of time as a nation and people supporting this Antarctic program in the past. And especially now, since the area where I was is closed off. There is no visitation at all to this area because of interference with wildlife, which is great because we're preserving it for the future. And right now, where's it going? Behind me. Right now, where people are going, other than the Palmer Peninsula, which is easy to get to, you can almost step on a rock and get there. It's so close to South America. It's down here. And we are chauvinists. We are Northern Hemisphere chauvinists. We think there's no Southern Hemisphere, but actually there's a whole lot back here. And where people go is from the tip near Ushuaia to somewhere people do. But there's a whole lot more to be seen here, and one of the places happens to be Cape Adare, which has a great history because it was the first location where any human, at least to our knowledge, spent the winter. And right now, and they have, when I was there, I camped there for a week, there are about 300,000 Adelie penguins. That's a lot of penguins. And so now the summer people are visiting Cape Adare, which there's kind of a daily population to support them.
Do you want to talk about Barnes Peak and all, and how that came about?
Yeah. Everyone who survived, I had a year in the South. And what happened, they picked scientists who had spent a year there with experiments to name a feature after them. Well, Antarctica is pretty big, 2 times the size of Australia. So there's all kinds of spots you can name the snowball after. And I had no expectation, and I got a letter from, after I had been back about 2 years, I got a letter from the National Science Foundation indicating that this feature called Barnes Peak, and you can look at it.
Yeah, the letter's right over there. You'll be able to see it.
Letters, and my wife proceeded to, for a birthday present, took the NSF letter indicating the dedication, and it's here, and also it indicates exactly where it is. It's got Queen
Alexander Range, yeah. It's 84 degrees south latitude, so it's much closer to the pole than certainly Hallett Station was.
And it's a little over 2 miles, and I've never seen it.
Well, I think one of your friends though was able to take a picture though, right?
Well, no, this was Cindy's science club at Churchill High School in Silver Spring had a contact with the NSF. And apparently they rooted through all the films they've taken and found this one here. And here's a picture of it. Taken from the plane because, frankly, I don't know if it's ever been climbed or not. It's here. Anyway, I had a wonderful time. I came back, and now I'm a senior and graduated, and I was offered to accompany one of the last surveys out of New Zealand with the dog team. And I thought this would be wonderful. But it would cost me another year, and I needed to work. So I passed it up. So. Okay, anyway, that's Scott anymore.
That's all our slides, so.
Okay, I can bore you for another 3 or 4 hours. That would be unpleasant.
What is the size of a penguin and a emperor penguin?
Well, the dailies are about 18 inches tall, about this big. Emperors are shoulder height. Back when others surveyed, there was a group of dogs, sled dogs. Sled dogs are pretty husky guys. And one of the emperors, flippered the sled dog off the ship, to give you an idea. They're very strong because these are swimming mussels. And incidentally, on ice, they are so, I don't think I have any pictures of that. On ice, they swim on the ice, on top of the ice, as well as underwater. They're very graceful. Yes?
I have a question. You said when you were in that little cabin, where you set up your...
Causeway Hut, yes.
Pardon?
I call it, it's where my experiments were, I call it a Causeway Hut.
Okay.
It was over the edge of the settlement, of the camp.
You said you a lot of times would sleep in there.
Yes, I slept on them because it was too hot in the camp.
Now, in winter, don't you get blizzards that come in? Could you have, I don't know how much snow you would get, could you have possibly gotten snowed in there?
No,
No?
no, I had no problem. Because normally the wind blew all the snow north, so it was not an issue.
How did you heat your living quarters?
We had a space heater that used fuel. And we had bladders there in the station, so there was enough fuel to last 3 years in case the icebreaker could not get in. So we had power, light, water. I mean, it was wonderful, and a movie every night.
How difficult was it to get from your Causeway Hut to the mess hall when there was a blizzard going, and what precautions did they take so that people would not get lost getting from, say, the hut to the mess hall in the time of a blizzard?
Hunger is a great driver. But really, the thing of more concern that we had with the high winds, the Quonset hut started to disintegrate. The sheets of, and would come down the center of the camp, and so you had to step out of their way as they blew past. But normally, never have I been delayed in getting to food. Yes.
What kind of expectations did you have before you went there? And was it what you had expected it to be?
It was totally different. I mean, dealing with the penguin rookery, and all these thousands of these cute little birds had a totally different life than I had ever. I'm a farm kid, and I grew up around with animals. But these were so cute. They really were, and they stayed awake 24 hours a day. They were always talking to each other. There was no quiet time ever.
Not something I would have imagined.
What temperature did you keep the Causeway Hut at?
I don't know, 65, maybe 64, depending upon when the wind was blowing. But I was never cold there. I'm a farm kid. And I got frostbitten in Pennsylvania. And not in the Antarctic. I feel humiliated.
Were there certain personalities that did not adapt well, and were there people that annoyed you very greatly?
We did lose at least one, but we should have lost maybe 2 more. But that's a personal opinion. Some people do not adapt very well to darkness, I'm afraid.
Because that goes on for months at a time, right?
Yes.
Over the winter, so.
Well, it does. I mean, like I said, midwinter is when we all went outside and looked up for the sun to reappear, and it disappeared again.
So then did it ever get totally dark?
you have to go a little further south. Matter of fact, during IGI, International Geophysical Year, of course, Admiral Byrd had already spent time on the Big White in the Antarctic. And so we decided, all the group of concerned nations, that who would build what where. And the Russians said, we'd like to build something here near Hallett and near the South Pole. And he was told, no, the Americans have already got a claim on the South Pole. So why don't you go over here, and this happens to be the pole of inaccessibility, which is one of the toughest places in the Antarctic. And they accepted that. And matter of fact, they got lucky. At Murray Station, they found there was this enormous lake, bigger than one of our Great Lakes, down 2 miles, that had apparently never been open to growing things for a long, long time. And they used a hot water technique and kept it sealed so they didn't contaminate anything. And it gave us a snapshot of life a long time ago, which is really very exciting. And they found other large buried lakes, which have interesting things. I'll put it like that.
Do you think that actually today, possibly the Russians and other countries have gone down there? What would prevent them? Like the other countries that formed an alliance down there. So they all agreed upon certain conditions. But don't you think, do you think or don't you think that today, maybe the Russians or somebody have actually...
No, people, there's typically, once you get outside the U.S., you become more of an international persona than you would have been when you have, for example, we don't talk about bombing each other anymore. And as I remember in the 50s when I was in the service, the question was, are our bombs bigger than your bombs? Well, we don't do that fear-mongering anymore. So kids don't have to learn to creep under desks in school. And that's great progress. So I would not expect people to act or behave things that were unpleasant, put it like that.
Did you keep a diary when you were down there?
Did you keep a diary? Did you keep a diary down there?
Yes, for a while, but after a while you could say, oh, it snowed today. I did, and of course I was with other colleagues. Unfortunately, they're starting to die. They're getting old, like I am. But I kept a diary, and the important thing I wanted to do was to be able to communicate with my wife-to-be what it was like to be away.
Well, you've done a lot of traveling in your lifetime, haven't you?
Yeah.
Any places that you particularly enjoyed or found interesting?
Oh, we would only have...
There's a whole other program, right?
Okay, I'm interested in big stone. Peru, Egypt.
Stonehenge.
Easter Island. Easter Island.
Easter Island, the Cooks, New Zealand. There's so much to learn. Admiral Cook was just an incredible individual. If you might want to be interested in looking at his biography. Although he made a couple personality bad judgments, I'll put it like that got him stabbed. But his incredible sailor.
I was interested in the picture with the skua with the feather in the hat. In Iceland, I was attacked by a skua. I came right, because I couldn't tell where the nests were.
You can't.
You can't, but I was in the middle of them. And he dive bombed me, but then went like this. And I was wondering, what does If I had a feather in my
You, a
hat,
feather, it makes all the difference.
well, what does the feather, do they go after the feather?
It's
or
count, are you familiar with the American Indians? It's called a counting coup. Before some unpleasant Europeans came along saying, we each want to take the scalp. The Indians had a technique for when there was a disagreement, you tap the person, and if you're able to tap his head, he was gone, and he fell over. It was part of a game they played. And so the Skua works the same way. All they do is they will fly by and just touch the top end of the feather. I wore something over my, keep my ears warm, and stuck the feather in that. And all they do is touch the top of that, and it was okay. I had been warned.
Yeah.
Too bad, you might consider that the next time you have
It
to
was
cross
like this
Skuas.
close and then
Yes.
it cut, but I'm like, wow.
Do you know about how many people did what you did before you? Because you were one of the last ones, and if it.
To Hallett, yes.
Yeah. Were there a lot of
They're all-
year-round?
No one made it all year long. No, at Hallett Station, we had two different classes of people. We had people who wintered over, and then we had summer people who came in and said, seen that, done that, bye. But really, people were still investigating how animals were able to live down there. And it's different. It really is truly different.
Do they know how the freshwater lakes formed under?
It's one of the great mysteries. It's like hearing the aurora borealis. Well, you've been very.
Do you ever get together with any of the people that you were down there with, or keep in
Yes.
contact?
Yes, one of the people that I actually attended the university with, he and I abuse each other verbally occasionally. But he survived the year. Two of the scientists I know have passed away. I mean, males only live so long. That's the point.
Would you consider coming back and talking
Oh, yes.
about stones?
I love it.
Wow.
I fell in love with the Antarctic because it was a wonderful environment. I could study as much as I wanted and could read all day, as long as I finished my 3-minute experiment.
Which you did most of the time?
I did.
I'm wondering if, like the penguins, you brought back a stone with you. Did you bring a stone back from Antarctica like the
I
penguins?
brought a whole footlocker. But frankly, at some point in time, I said, they're not worth moving anything. Yes.
Did you take any photographs of the northern lights?
I got the northern lights, but I drove over my trumpets.
Yeah, did you have any pictures of them?
Did you have any pictures of the borealis? Well, I know we don't, but did you take any?
Yes, I did. These happen to be, we had some interesting clouds called nacreous clouds, which are very high altitude clouds. And I had pictures, like I said, I can bore you for hours, but
not at night. You didn't have any pictures of astronomical phenomena or.
behind you.
Well, no, not sunsets, but just borealis.
Oh, yes. Matter of fact, you can look at this one here and see the high winds in the background. Here, that's blowing snow off the mountain. And there were nacreous clouds. This is perhaps related. And there's a bird, I think, here, a Skuas circling. I was able to catch one of the very large birds without damaging it. Okay, I wasn't trying to hurt it. I got it in a position where it couldn't take off because of the water. And I was able to get a picture of it.
We don't have it.
We don't have it. Anyway, thank you very much.
One more question. How often could you see the borealis while you were there?
It was very frequent. That was one of the things that people were very interested in, because the outpourings, like I said, the Earth really rotates inside the sun. And that was one of the reasons for many of these programs, to understand the interaction between the Earth and the rest of the solar system. Later on, after I came back, in Hudson's Bay, we shot sounding rockets up to the upper atmosphere to measure the atmospheric constituents. But that's another story about polar bears in the Arctic, and there are no polar bears in the Antarctic. Well, thank you very much. You've been,